Okay, so our recording is on. So today is Hey Sivan, and there's three interesting things that I want to mention. One of the things that happened on Hey Sivan was the Israelis bombed the Osirak reactor, the nuclear reactor that Saddam Hussein built in Iraq. Now, I didn't know this, but Saddam Hussein called his nuclear reactor Tammuz, which was the month he held that he was a reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. And because of that, he figured he'll call the reactor Tammuz because that was the month in which Nebuchadnezzar conquered the city of Yerushalayim. So that's why he called it Tammuz. And it didn't work out. So Zan Tammuz became his Tisha B'Av because they took out the reactor, and one of the pilots was Ilan Ramon, who Nebuch was nifter later on in a space shuttle disaster. So they saved a lot of Eden by doing that. Today's also the yahrzeit of the Rosh Hashanah of Los Angeles, Reb Chaim Fassman, who is Shai Botnick's Mechutin. And it's also the yahrzeit of a Dai in Lakewood, whose name is Gabriel Finkel. Okay, so let's get started. Now, we're up to Amalei Ravina Rashi, which is really right in the middle of the Gemara explaining the Bryce of Abaye. Because of that, I just want to quickly run through the Bryce of Abaye to bring us to where we are at the start of today's Gemara. So I'm just going to run through together the Bryce and just remind yourselves the different reasons for each thing. So Abaye Misader Seidim Maracha Mishmei the Gemara Balibad Abashol. So the first thing he said was the Maracha Gedoyla, the big flame they set up, Koidem Maracha Shnishal Ketayos. And the Gemara quoted a pasuk to explain why. It says, Al Mizbech Kalalayla Veisha Mizbech Tukadboy, and that's how we know that they first did the big Maracha, then they did the little Maracha. We learned in the Gemara because it says V'arach Aleha. Aleha says that there must be two, and the Torah is telling you to put the wood on one of the two, which means both of them must have already been set up. The Maracha Gedoyla, the Maracha Shloch Shoktaris, and then they put the wood on the large Maracha. Then Sidur Shnei Gezreisim Kodim L'Dishim Mizbech Apnimi. Sidur Shnei was before Dishim Mizbech Apnimi. The Gemara said either because it was a hechsher for kapara, the wood is what you prepare to eventually take coals from to bring the ketayos, or the Gemara said is because since you're already on the big mizbeach, you might as well finish up whatever business you have on the big mizbeach before you head into the heichal. And the third story the Gemara said was that if there's no maracha ketano because they didn't have enough wood, they would take wood from the maracha gedoylo for the ketayos. Then the V'dishim Mizbech HaPnimi was Kodem L'Tavish Chomesh Neres. The Gemara said the reason for that is because when you walked into the Heichal, the first keli that you encountered was the Mizbeach. So that's why you first did the mitzvah on the Mizbeach of Dishon, and then you headed off to the Menorah to do Atavish Chomesh Neres. Then the Gemara said Atavish Chomesh Neres comes before Dam HaTamid. And the reason why it comes before Dam HaTamid is, remember, we said that there's two baboikers referring to the Atzei Hamaracha, the Shnei Gzir Eitzim, it says Baboiker twice. Varach Aleh, it says Baboiker, Varach Aleh, the Pasuk says. And since we don't need those two Baboikers, we apply one Baboiker to the Hatovas HaNeiros, which makes it into three Baboikers, because Hatovas HaNeiros already has two Baboikers, and if we borrow one Baboiker from the Eitzim and we add it to the Hatovas HaNeiros, we're left with three Baboikers by Atavas HaNeiros, and we take another boiker and we add it to the boiker by the carbon tamid, which leaves it with two boikers. So first comes Atavas Chomesh Neiros, then comes Atavas Shnei Neiros, then comes the Dam HaTamid, and then comes Atavas Shnei Neiros, and we said Atavas Shnei Neiros is after the Dam HaTamid because the Tamid is kapara and the Shnei Neiros is not kapara. Therefore, it's logical that bringing the carbon tamid should be first. And this is where we were up to in the pasuk. We were up to discussing the two extra baboikers that is in the pasuk of the Shnei Gzir Eitzim, and we applied one to the Dam HaTamid and one to the Atavish Chamish Neris. On that, Frek the Gemara, Omer Le Ravina Le Ravashi. So we're starting about 15 or 20 lines up from the bottom of the Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis. Omer Le Ravina Le Ravashi. Hi Baboiker de Eitzim. The two extra Baboikers by Eitzim, you said they're extra, and because they're extra, you apply them. Because they're extra, you apply them to the Dam Atomid as well as to the Atavesh Chomish Neretz. But Mimi Yasser, who said Baboiker by Eitzim is extra? Hamiboyle Legufei. You needed to teach you a halacha by Shnei Gziri Eitzim itself. Now we learned earlier that Shnei Gziri Eitzim comes after the setting up of the small Maroch of Ketairis. And we just reviewed, the reason for that was because it says V'arech Aleha, which means you should be set up the wood on one of the two flames, which obviously means that both flames are already taken care of. So Frek the Gemara, maybe the Baboiker that it says in the pasuk of Shnei Gziri Eitzim, the Kamar Rachmana, is the Niktamula Maroch Shnei Shel Ketairis. Maybe from Baboiker you should learn that instead of, like we said, that the Shnei Gziri Eitzim is after the Maroch Shnei Shel Ketairis, maybe the Baboiker by Eitzim should tell you that it precedes the Maroch Shnei Shel Ketairis. Omer Lei. So Rav Ashi answered back to Ravina, did you forget what we just learned on Omid Aleph? V'lav miu kimna aleh v'loy al chaverta mechalal d'isa l'chaverta. Didn't we just say the reason why the Shnei Gziri Eitzim had to be after the Maroch Shnei Shel Ketairis is because by the Shnei Gziri Eitzim it says aleh v'loy al chaverta. So you cannot say that the Shnei Gziri Eitzim comes before the Maroch Shnei, it comes after. That renders the Baboiker by the Shnei Gziri Eitzim as extra, and we could connect one Baboiker to the Atavish Chamish Neros, making three, one Baboiker to the Dam Atomid. So that's why first you are made of Chamish Neros, and then you do the Dam Atomid. Frek the Gemara, you have to split up the Atavish Neros into two parts. We discussed it. It has to be separated by something. You split it into two parts. So we split it 5 and 2. Frek the Gemara, why do you split it that way? Why not Navid Hatavish Teineris Bereisha? If you're splitting it 5 and 2, so do the 2 first and do the 5 second. Or maybe 4 and 4, right? There's different ways to split it. But why? Maybe 4 and 3. Why Bidafke 2 and 5? And why is the 2? Why isn't the 2 first? So the Askal Bahu Ovid Rubel. Once you started, we want you to do as many as possible, leaving over the minimal amount of Neiros for the second batch of Atavas Neiros. For the Navitchis, the menorah has 7 branches. So why don't you, on the first visit, be made of all 6 Neiros and leave 1 over for later? And for the Gemara, Amar Kra, Be'tivoy es Neir Shektirena. When should you do the Ketarias? After you're mative the plural Neiros. So it must be that the second batch of Neiros that you're being mative was plural, and the minimum amount of neiros that you can refer to with a plural adjective, so that takes us to the point of the neiros. Now Abai continues. The hatavish neiros comes before the ketores. The Amar Kra, the pasuk says and then v'hadu yaktirem. Now it's important that I remind you that we're learning the brisa Alibo da Abishol that we learned on Daf Tesvav, and I'm not reminding you this just to remind you because it's going to come into play on Amud Aleph. But if you remember, there was a shita of the Rabbanon who said that the Ketores was not after the second Atavos Neiros. The Ketores was in between the 2 Atavos, and the Dam Atomid that Abishol says was in between the 2 Atavos was before that Atavos. So Abishol, which we're learning, the order was first there was the Atavish Chamish Neiros, then there was the Dam Hatamid, then there was Atavish Tei Neiros, and after that there was the Ketores. According to the Rabbanon, it was different. First there was the Dam Hatamid, then there was the Atavish Chamish Neiros, then there was the Ketores, and then there was the Atavish Tei Neiros. But we're now focused on Abishol, and he says the reason why the Hatavish Shtei Neros was before the Ketores is because it says Be'tiva Neros Yaktirena. First, you have to be made to Neros, and only after that can you bring the Ketores. Uketaris Levar. After they were marked to the Ketores, then they took the Evarim of the carbon Talmud up onto the Mizbeach. How do you know that? The Tanya we learned, Yuktam Dover Shenemar Boy Baboiker Baboiker. It's logical that the Ketores, where the Torah refers to it, using the word Baboiker twice, indicating it should be as early as possible, Ledovar to the carbon Talmud, Shaloi Nemar Boy Ella Boiker Echad Bilvad. By the carbon Talmud, it only says one Boiker. And therefore, it's logical that the carbon Talmud, the Evarim, should be brought onto the Mizbeach after the Hatavish Shtei Neros. I'm sorry, after the Ketores. So you might ask, we just had a moment earlier that you're borrowing an extra Baboiker, which now makes the Baboiker by Dam Talmud 2 as well. So Rashi, that's only referring to the Dam. The Evarim don't have an extra Baboiker. I'm sorry for interrupting. Somebody was speaking.
Yeah, no, just a question. Yes, just previously you said that the Abishol is the one who says that you do the 5 and the 2 in a row, and the pasuk he brings
No, you don't do the 5 and 2 in a row. You have the Dam Talmud in between the 5 and 2.
Only the Dam Talmud and not
the Ketores. The Ketores is done after the 2.
Oh, I see. Okay,
and the Rabban just shifted forward. The Dam Talmud is before the 5, and he has the Ketores in between the 5 and 2.
Okay, sure.
Okay, and then the Gemara says after they brought the Evarim of the carbon Talmud onto the Mizbeach, then they brought the carbon Mincha that was connected to the carbon Talmud. The Tanya, Minayin Shelo Yehei Dover Kodim L'Talmud Shel Shachar. How do we know that the very first carbon of the day that you're allowed to place on the Mizbeach is the carbon Talmud? So to Gemara, Talmud Loimar V'Arach Aleha Ha'oila, referring to placing the Evarim of the Talmud on the Mizbeach. Rava, and Rava says, Ha'oila hi oila rishona. The oila that we're talking about is the oila rishona, meaning the carbon Talmud is the very first carbon whose evarim should be placed on the mizbeach each day, and then after that is the mincha. Now the next part of the brayso says mincha lechavitin. You brought the carbon mincha before you brought the second carbon mincha that was brought by the Kohen Gadol himself. Why is that? Because the pasuk says oila umincha. It says in the pasuk oila umincha to teach you that the menachas of the oila have to be right after the oila, and only then can you do the chavitin. The chavitin l'nesachim. Why do the chavitin come before the nesachim? If you think about it, the chavitin is not connected to the carbon Talmud. It's just the kohen's personal mincha. The nesachim are connected to the carbon Talmud. Because shom mincha, once the Torah tells us that a mincha comes before the chavitin, then we're going to bring all the menachas, whether they're connected or not, all the menachas will be brought before the nesachim. And then the nesachim l'musafim, the nesachim came before the carbon musaf. If it was Shabbos, for instance, with the carbon musaf, you always poured the nesachim of the carbon Talmud before the musaf. So someone asked me, like, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you want to finish up completely the Talmud before you got involved with the Musaf? And I don't know the answer, but the Gemara did require a pasuk to explain it. Zavach u'nesachim. It says in the pasuk first Zavach and then Nesachim to tell you that right after the carbon Talmud you should do Nesachim. U'musafim levazichin. This is my favorite. On Shabbos they first brought the carbon Musaf and then they did the bazichin levayla. So let's remember, what were the bazichin? The bazichin were spices that were kept in a spoon on the shulchan. And before the kohanim can partake in eating the lechem aponim that was distributed to the kohanim, they had to first be makriv the bazichin on the mizbeach. So Abaye said, in the name of Abishol, according to Abishol, that the carbon musaf was brought before the bazichin. In fact, the more about Tanya bazichin carbon the musafin. The bazichin were before. So the more Tanoim to machlek is Tanoim. And the svara for the machlekes name is very simple. The kohanim couldn't eat the lechem aponim before they brought the bazichin on the mizbeach. The question is, were these brought before musaf or after musaf? Well, that's the age-old question. Is Kiddush Club before musaf, or are you supposed to wait until after davening to make Kiddush? So the Tana who held that they did the Bazichin before Musaf, he obviously used to go to Kiddush Club, and he understood that we have to have the Lechem upon them before Musaf, because that's how Kiddush Club works. The Tana who held after it said, no, you got to wait till after davening to make Kiddush. The Gemara Tanoi. That's one shot. The Gemara has a real shot. Tanoi. Amar Abaye. Abaye said, Mistavra command the Amar Musafin Koidem Lovzich. I think it's more logical. It's funny that Abaye is actually taking a side in the Machlekes Tanoi. Why is it Mistavra? Lav mi Amrit. Didn't we just say earlier that Baboiker Lahaktim? Something that has the word Baboiker mentioned in it indicates that it should be done as early as possible. So if that's the case, Hachanami Bayoim Bayoim, it says Bayoim HaShabbos, they bring the Bezich Levina. It says Bayoim twice. Bayoim has a Mashmois, Rashi says, as later in the day, like in the high noon, when the day is big. So Bayoim has a connotation to do it later. So since it says Bayoim twice, referring to Bezichin, it makes sense to say it should be as late as possible, and therefore if we have a choice whether or not it should be before Musaf or after Musaf, we should push it off until after Musaf. So that's a very good svara. So if that's the case, my taima, the man da Amar, Bezichin Kodmin L'Musafin. So then what would be the reason why you would hold that the Bezichin are before the Musafin? Zaktamara, because Gomer Chuka Mechavik, there's a Gzer Shava. The word Chuka is mentioned talking about Bezichin, and the word Chuka is mentioned talking about the Chavitin, the Minchas Chavitin, which is much earlier, which was even before the Nesachim. So that's why we suggest that the Bezichin should be brought before Musaf. Frank Gemara, Ime Hasam, Gomar, if you want to compare the Bezichin to the Chavitin, well then Ligmar Akula Milsam Hasam, then you should bring the Bezichin way earlier at the time where you bring the Chavitin, which is before the Nesachim. So Gemara, Lahachi Hani B'yoyim B'yoyim L'Acher. It also says B'yoyim B'yoyim. So you have B'yoyim B'yoyim telling you that there's a Bezichin should be later. You have the Gzer Shavach Chukut say it should be earlier. So you have it being pulled in both directions. So as a compromise, we'll say it won't be as early as the Chavitin, but at least it'll be earlier than the Musaf, and therefore Kiddush Club is endorsed. Okay, now we're finished with the Bryce of Abaye. So now, if when we're rushing in the morning to catch up to the minyan, and we're rushing through Karbonas, and we're saying the Bryce of Abaye, we should stop for a second to try to recall this Gemara so that we could tap in to the powerful skula that the Shulchan Aruch tells us you get when you say the Bryce of Abaye. And for those who don't make it, you can always put $1 into Kupat Ha'ir, and then you can get anything you ever want. Zok Tahele v'Gemara Vayter. Ketayres shel Shachar ha'shekreve ben dam levar. The Mishnah that we learned, I believe, on Lamed Aleph in the days, tells us the order of certain items. And it says that the Ketayres of Shachris, I believe it's Lamed Aleph in the days, is it there? Yes. Ketayres of Shachris was brought between the dam and the ivar. So let's stop a second. To understand. We learned according to Abaye, according to the Brisa that we learned, you first did Hatavish Chomesh Neris, then you did Dam Atomid, then you did Hatavish Shtei Neris, then you did Ketayres, and then you did Evar. So what do you mean Ketayres or Shachar is being Dam Evar? It should say it's between Hatavish Shnei Neris and Evar. Indeed, it's technically correct that it was Beidam Levarim, but why don't you pick a tighter frame? Let's pick the avodah that was right before, which was the Atavish Teineris, and the avodah that was right after, which was Evar. That's according to Abba Shaul. According to the Rabbanon, let's look at the order. The order was Hatavish Chomesh Neris, then Ketayres, then Hatavish Teineris, then Evar. So once again, Bein Dam Levarim doesn't make sense. It should say Bein Neris Levarim. So Zoktim Armani, our Mishnah, who says this order, Ketayres, that means you have first Dam, then Ketayres, then Levarim. Which Tana is this? Rabbanon, if you want to argue it's going according to Rabbanon, it should say Bein Dam Leneris Mebayale. Because first was the Dam, then was the Ketayres, and then there was Atavish Teineris. And he Abba Shaul, And if you want to argue that the Mishnah is going according to Abishol, it should say Beineris Leivar Miboyle, because it was after that Tavish Beineris. So really, we're going according to the Rabbanah. But Uvisidra like a Mari, we're not being uber particular in the exact order. It's giving us the general order. For Taisvis, once you're saying Uvisidra like a Mari, so why are we still like that Rabbanah? Then it can go like Abishol too. Zok Taisvis, we look at the bottom line of Taisvis because it's obvious from the earlier portion of the Mishnah that our Mishnah surely is not following Abishol. If I look at the very last line, Yesh Loimar, we might as well do the whole thing. Why didn't the Gemara say could be going like Abishol as well? So tomorrow Mishum the Reisha, the like Abishol. The Reisha of the Mishnah that we learned does not comply with the order of Abishol. The Ketani v'nichnas lahakter ketaris. The Kohen went in to do the ketaris ulaheta v'neiris kedamar perkama, which means the ketaris was before the neiris. According to Abishol, the ketaris is after the neiris. So anyway, the Gemara knew that our Mishnah is not consistent with Abishol, so our Gemara just focused on showing how our Mishnah would be consistent with the Rabbanon. Okay, let's see the Gemara weiter. Gets easier. Vishal Bein Harabayim, the Kataris of Bein Harabayim, Haisakreva Bein Evarim Lunasach. So let's review a second. The Kataris Shal Shachar, when was it brought? According to Abishol, it was brought after the Tavish Teineris, before the Evarim, right? Kataris Kodemis LeEvarim, like we learned. And according to Rabbanon, it was even earlier than that. But the Kataris of Ben Arbaim was brought after the Evarim, but before the Nesachim. So once again, the Kataris al Shachar was brought before the Evarim. The Kataris al Ben Arbaim was brought after the Evarim. Zok Tamar, we know Hanamili, how do you know this? Omar B'Yechan, and B'Yechan said, the Omar Kra, in Parshas Pinchas, in the Parshas V'Shchayish, it says, Kaminchas HaBoiker Ucheniskai Tasev. It's talking about the second Talmud, and it says, the second Talmud, its mincha should be just, its mincha and its nesachim, it should be just like the mincha and the nesachim of the first Talmud. Ma minchas haboker, ketayris kodemis l'nesachim. Just like the mincha in the morning, the ketayris was before the mincha and before the nesachim. Afkan, so too by the Talmud Shabbat Abayim, ketayris kodemis l'nesachim, the ketayris should be before the nesachim. In fact, the Gemara, if you're comparing it to the Kataris in the morning, well, the Kataris in the morning was before the Mincha, was before the Nesachim, but it was way before that. It was before the Evarim as well. So, Halam Kataris Kademis Le'Evarim, Afkan Kataris Kademis Le'Evarim. If you're comparing the two Kataris, well, we know for sure the Kataris in the morning was brought before you were Makrib the Evarim. So, if that's the case, why not by the Talmud Shal Bein Arbaim as well? So, Gemara, because you're not looking at the words. Miksiv Ke'evare Haboiker. It doesn't say that the Evarim of the Talmud Shal Bein Arbaim should be like the Evarim of the Talmud Shal Shachris, which means they should be after the Ketaris. It doesn't say that. It says Keminchas Haboiker Ksiv, which means Keminchas Haboiker v'lo Ke'evare Haboiker. It should be like the Mincha, meaning the Ketaris preceded it. So too, Bein Arbaim, the Ketaris will precede the Mincha, but not the Evarim. So first the Evarim, then the Ketaris Shal Bein Arbaim, and then the Mincha. Tanu Rabbanan. It says in the pasuk V'niskai Revi Yisayid. So we really have to look at the whole pasuk in context. And unfortunately, at home I don't have a Geshmak Gemara. I don't have the psukim on it. So I'm going to bring it up in the Chumash. It's in Parshas Pinchas. Let me just pull it up quickly. See if we can find it over here. Oh, here we go. Tzav es b'nei Yisrael v'yamar talayim es karban nilach l'ishai talking about the carbon tamid reich nechoichi tishmeru lakar v'li b'mayada. That's talking about the carbon tamid shel boiker. V'yamar talayim za isha shet kribu l'Hashem kevasam b'nei tamimim shnayim l'yoyim oilasam. Bring 2 tamids daily. Es akeves echot tasa b'boiker. The first carbon you're going to bring in the morning. There's a kavis hasheni tasa bein arba, and the second kavis you should bring bein arba. So if I asked you what time during the day are we right now, we're by the Talmud Shal Bein Arbaim, because it just said V'zakefes Hasheni Tasa Bein Arbaim. Now, what does the pasuk say weiter? Which carbon Talmud is this pasuk referring to? I would guess that it's referring to the Talmud Shal Bein Harbayim, because it mentions it right after Tasa Bein Harbayim. Well, let's go on and see what else comes up. Again, it's all after the Torah already mentioned the Bein Harbayim. But look what the pasuk says next. The Es HaKeves Hasheni Tasa Bein Harbayim. So suddenly, now we're switching to Bein Harbayim. So these psukim in the middle, are they referring to the carbon Talmud Shel Shachar, or are they referring to the carbon Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim? The psukim that tell us about the Nesachim, is the pasuk directly addressing the carbon Talmud Shel Shachar, or is the pasuk addressing the carbon Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim? Another point that I want to speak out over here is the Niska Revi saying Lakeves Ha'echad. That would also make it sound like it's talking about the Talmud in the morning. Lakeves Ha'echad, the Keves number one. So we have conflicting mashmoyisin that we're going to have to sort out. So Zokt the Gemara.
Can't you answer it? Ain't muktam amucha b'Torah?
Yes, you could, but we're looking to analyze to figure out what's going on. So let's see what the Gemara says. It says as follows: Tanur Rabbanan v'niskay revius ahin yilamed shel shachas mishal arvus. The Tanna Kama learns that it must be talking about the Talmud Shel Bein Arbaim, like we said earlier, because it said it after V'zakefes Hasheni Tasa Bein Arbaim. Now we know there's nesachim of revius ahin for the Talmud Shel Bein Arbaim. And we'll say, just like by the Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim, there's Nesachim of a Revi'is Yayin, so too by the Talmud Shel Shachris, there's Nesachim of a Revi'is Ahin, of Yayin. That's the Tanna Kama. Rabbi Yomer, no, it's talking about the Talmud Shel Shachar. And if anything, Arvis Mishal Shachris. The pasuk is referring to the Talmud Shel Shachar, and we learn the same halacha to the Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim. Now, it's interesting what this machlokes is, because regardless, we know the same halacha for the Talmud Shel Shachar and the Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim. The machlokes merely is how you learn it. So the question is, why would they argue about something if there's no nafka mina l'halacha? So as I'm talking to you, I notice Tosfos. Merely the ike beinai. What's the difference if you're learning Arvis from Shachris or Shachris from Arvis? Either way, you know the Sachim in both places. What if the tzibur didn't have enough wine to satisfy both karbonis? They only had enough wine to satisfy one carbon. According to Rebbe, who the main one is shachris, and you just apply to arvis as well. So if you only had one, you would be makrit by shachris. And because the Mandar holds the main mention of Nesachim was by Arvis, and we just applied the Shachas as well, then Yakrivim Arvis. So that would be the Nafkamina. So Dr. Gemara, Bishlamel Rabbana, who learns that the main expression of Nesachim is referring to the Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim, Hai b'Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim Ksiv. It makes sense because after the pasuk said, "As HaKeves Hasheni Tasa Bein Harbayim," only then does the Torah go into the Nesachim. Ela Rebbe, my time. Why does Rebbe learn that it's referring to the Talmud Shel Shachar? It's out of context. Omer Rabba Bar Ula, Omer Kra, Lakeves Ha'echad. Because in the pasuk itself of Nesachim, it says, "V'niska Revi saying Lakeves Ha'echad." Ezehu Keves Shenemer Ba'echad. Which Talmud is referred to by the Torah using the word Echad? Ha'va'im is the Talmud Shel Shachar. It says, "As HaKeves Ha'echad Tasev Ha'boiker." So the Keves Ha'echad is referring to the Talmud Shel Shachar. In fact, the Gemara for Rabbanon, how are the Rabbanon going to? It says in the pasuk, "When the scribes like Keves Ha'echad." What is the Rabbanon going to learn Echad? If the Rabbanon is learning that this is referring to the Talmud Shel Bein Harbayim, what is the lashon Echad? Zok the Gemara means miyuchad shebe'edra. You learn from this Echad that when you pick an animal for a carbon, don't just pick anyone. Pick the best that you have to be the carbon Talmud. The Rebbe, how is Rebbe going to know this halacha if he uses Echad to teach us that it's referring to the carbon Talmud Shel Shachar? You learn from a different pasuk, me'umivchar nidarecha nafka. It's from a different pasuk that's referring to Nedarim and Nedavis, where it says when you give a neder of a carbon, you should give the best that you have. For Rabbanan, the Rabbanan held you needed a separate pasuk to tell you b'chayva. By a carbon chayv, you have to use the best carbon. The chad b'nedava, and you need a separate pasuk by nedava to tell you that you have to pick your best carbon utrichi, and you need both, because if you only had the pasuk to tell you by nedavas that it has to be the best carbon, you wouldn't necessarily know that by a mandatory carbon it has to be the best carbon. Because you might tell you're giving an extra carbon. If you want to give a gift as a staff design. Don't be a knacker. Don't be a knacker. And if it's a carbon shel chiyuv, you might think that you don't have to give the best because maybe I just have to be mekayim chiyuv. It's not. I don't have to show any special goodwill. I just got to do my job. Even when you do a chiyuv, you got to do it the best. So David brought up a good child that we were probably all thinking of, and that is we already know from Cain and Hevel that it's not a good idea not to offer the best of what you have. I think it's a good aura, but I think this is more like a mamish chiyuv. In the derecha, you have to take from the best. They're just a story that didn't end well for either one. But the aura is a good one. You see already in the Torah from Cain and Hevel that the better carbon was accepted from Hevel, but Cain's, being that he didn't take the best fruit, his carbon was rejected. Zok the Gemara weiter. Im haya kohen gadol zokin istins. What if the kohen gadol was a zokin istins? He couldn't handle the cold water. They were able to warm the water up for him. Tanya zok the Gemara. Omer Yehuda. How did they warm it up? How did they warm up this mikveh? Asosi shel barzel. They took nuggets of steel. They put them into a fire on Yom Kippurim, so they became very hot steel. And they put them into cold water. We'll learn Pashup Shat, they put it right into the mikveh. The warm metal will warm up the water. Now, clearly, this wasn't red hot metal when they put it in, because if it was, you'd have a problem of bishul. You're not allowed to cook. It would be an isha deraisa. So it wasn't enough to cook the water, but it was enough to warm it up. Now, Yatzei Ledes L'chumra, according to Rabbi Ox, is 103 degrees Fahrenheit. A normal mikveh, they normally set anywhere between 90 and 103 Fahrenheit, is typically where most mikvehs are set to. Unless you go, in Satmar, there are 3 mikvehs. There's one for the mother bear, one for the father bear, and one for the baby bear. So I remember when I was a yeshiva bacher, and I used to go to Williamsburg to my grandparents for Shabbos, I'd go to the mikveh, and there would be one mikveh that's packed, and there'd be another mikveh that was pretty full. There was one mikveh that was empty. And I'm thinking to myself, why would I want to go into a packed, filthy mikveh? Let me go into the empty mikveh. So I give a spinning around in the empty mikveh, and did I yelp so loud that mikveh was like boiling, bubbling? I came out with skin falling off me. And then I chapped why nobody was in that mikveh. So I remember that. So that's not how hot this mikveh was. They just had to take away the bite. So David asking in bishul achar bishul, we're worried that the water in the mikveh was not cooked. By putting a red hot metal inside it, you're going to cook the water in the mikveh that was actually cold, never cooked. So let's see what we have over here. So they put this warmed metal into the water to warm it up. You have another problem. When you take metal that was very hot and you plunge it into cold water, it forges the steel. It strengthens it. So you're strengthening the steel. What's that malacha? That's called makabapatish. Because after they would form a keli, the very last thing that they would do would be plunge it into cold water, and that would harden it. So why isn't that a problem? How would they be allowed to do this on Yom Kippur? We're talking about steel that you never got it that hot, so that when you plunge it into cold water, it would be considered forging. And therefore, there's no problem here of tziruf, and that's why they were able to do it. Abaya Omar, afilu temesh shegil tziruf. Even if the metal got very, very hot, so when you plunge it into cold water, it will actually strengthen it. That's not a problem. You know why? Davar she'ein mischav mutter. You're not trying to forge the steel here. You're just trying to warm up the water. So you're doing a malacha shaloi b'kavana. For instance, there's a machlokes if you on Shabbos if you drag a heavy bench across a yard, across grass, and it's digging a trench as you're dragging it. So there's a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. If davar shein mischaven is mutar or aser, Rabbi Yehuda holds it's aser, and Rabbi Shimon holds it's mutar. So zok to Gemara. Umi Amar Abaya Haki, does Abaya hold that a davar shein mischaven is mutar? Well, Tanya we learned besar erlosai. It says uvayim hashemini yimal besar erlosai. On the 8th day, you have to make a bris. Even if on the place of the orla that the moil is going to cut off, there's a nega and there's a lav, you're not allowed to cut off a nega. You're allowed to cut off this nega as part of the bris. Divi Rabbi Yoshia, that's what Rabbi Yoshia. Favinamba, the Gemara asked the Kashan Rabbi Yoshia, Kral Amali, why don't you need a pasuk to tell me you're allowed to do this? It's a davar shein mechaven. It should be mutter without a pasuk. V'amar Abaye li Rabbi Yehuda. It's going according to Rabbi Yehuda. Amar davar shein mechaven aser. So for the Gemara, you see Abaye hold davar shein mechaven aser. So how could you put the metal into water to davar shein mechaven, which should be aser? And for the Gemara,
is there any nafkamina if it's a psik ratio or not?
Yes, Tosus asked the kasha. It's a big problem, psik ratio. The Tosus, I don't have Tosus Shonim, but Tosus Shonim asks, or I might have it over here at the bottom. That is a psik ratio, and I'm gonna address that in a minute. It's a very, very good kasha. There's a couple of terutzim on it, but let me just finish the Gemara because it's going to be relevant to how the machlokes Rashi and Tosfos in the conclusion of the Gemara. Zok the Gemara, the Amar Rabbi Yehuda, that it's going on to Rabbi Yehuda. Everything more everywhere else by an Isser Dairaisa. That's where Rabbi Yehuda holds davar shein mechaven is also, like cutting off a beheres. Aval hacha tziruf derabanan hu, but here this tziruf would only be derabanan. So the question is, why would this tziruf only be derabanan? The other kasha you have was what Moshe asked, a beautiful kasha. It's psik reisha. So the Tosfos Shoshanim says it could be psik reisha deloy nichalei, because who said it's his own metal? If he used somebody else's metal, where he doesn't benefit whether that metal becomes forged, that would be a psik reisha deloy nichalei, and that might not be a problem. The other svars they say is maybe they didn't leave it in the water long enough to that we know for sure it will be mitzurif. There's different ways around it. But the other problem is why is it derabanan over here? Why would tziruf be derabanan? So one svar the Tosfos offers is, when is tziruf asur midaraisa? If I have a pitcher that I made out of metal and I plunge it into cold water to strengthen it, that's makah b'patish. But here you don't have kalim, you have metal nuggets that aren't kalim at all. So making them hard gives me really no benefit. That's not a malach of makah b'patish because they're not kalim. They're just metal that I'll probably melt down and make into something else. So therefore, tziruf won't be deraisa under those conditions. Tziruf is only derabanan. So since the whole issue is derabanan to begin with, and it's a davar shein mechaven, it's a double derabanan, therefore it would be allowed over here. However, there was a girsa that Rashi says is not valid, and ain't shvus b'mikdash. Since there's no Isser D'Rabbanan in the Beis HaMikdash, that's why it was mutter. Rashi says you're not garish it, because anyway, it's the whole thing is D'Rabbanan, and if it's only Isser D'Rabbanan, there's no problem of davar shein mechaven aser according to Rabbi Yehuda. Tosfos argues on Rashi, and Tosfos holds could be tziruf daraisa, or could be Rabbi Yehuda holds that even for an Isser D'Rabbanan, davar shein mechaven is aser. So Tosfos is garish that ain't shvus b'mikdash, that even though it's a derabanan, but since this is in the Beis HaMikdash, therefore they're allowed to do it. And this opens up a whole another interesting issue, because if you notice, when are we discussing this mikvah? After this is the second mikvah. This is not the first mikvah. This is the second mikvah. The first mikvah was on Watergate, which was not within the confines of the Azara. So there they wouldn't have been able to do this according to Tosfos, because you don't say Ein Shvus B'Mikdash if you're not in the Mikdash. The mikveh that was in the base of Parva, that was in the base of Mikdash, only there would you be able to argue Ein Shvus B'Mikdash. Although there are those who say that the rule of Ein Shvus B'Mikdash refers to any base of Mikdash business even though it was on Har Bayis, even though it was not within the confines of the Azara. And there are those who learn, some Sofer learns, if you look at the Lashon, they would warm something up and put it into Tzonim. They learned that they actually warmed up a small pitcher of water and then they poured the pitcher of water into the mikvah. That's how the Chasam Sofer learns. Okay, so now let's go on to the next Mishnah. From here on, it's very easy. Gemara, Agad's Gemara, Geshmak Gemara. Hevi'u leveis haparva. Now, after he finished with his big day Zahav, doing the carbon tumid, it was time for the Kohen Gadol to go into the Beis Kodesh HaKodeshim, so they brought him to the Beis HaParva to Teufel. The mikvah on the roof of the Beis HaParva was within the perimeter of the Azara. Parsu sudden shalbutz beinoy lebeinaam. They put up a barrier of white linen as a screen so the gawkers can't see him. The Kiddush Yadav V'Raglav, before he took off his big day Zav, he made Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim like the Rabbanon. Upashat, and only then did he take off his big day Zav. Rab Meir, we learned, said no. First Pashat, he took off his clothing, and then Kiddush Yadav V'Raglav. And then Yarad V'Taval, he went into the mikveh. Although he came out, when they stopped it, and they wiped him with a towel. Hey, Viu like big day love, and they brought him to big day love. Lavash, he put him on. And then once again, the Kiddush Yadav V'Raglav. Now we know he went into the Beis Kodesh HaKodeshim twice. Once to do all the avodas, and then once to remove the kaf and the machta. So Zokt, the Mishnah, he didn't wear the same set of clothing for both of those entries. B'shachar hayolovish pelusin. In the morning, he used the most chosheve linen that grew in Pelusin, which is in northern Egypt, which actually is right on the banks of the Suez Canal. In those days, there was no Suez Canal, but that's where this place was located. And it was very expensive, it was worth Shoshnei Maser Mona. It was worth 1,200 zuzim. Ben Harbayim, when he was just going to take out the Kavamachta, he used less expensive clothing. Hinduyim, they were from Hindu, I assume they're Indian, from India, but Rashi says from Eretz Kush. So I'm not sure what that is. Shel Shmoyna Meyai Zuz, that was only worth 800 zuz. Divrei Reb Meir, that's what Reb Meir said. The Chachamim Oimrim, B'shachar hayuloive shel Shmoyna Asemana, it was worth 1,800 zuz. Ben Arbaim shel Shnei Asemana, it was worth 1,200 zuz. Hakoil Shloshim Mana, between both begodim, it was worth 30 mana, 300 zuz. The Gemara is going to ask, is the Mishnah giving us a math lesson? How to add, and the Gemara will deal with it. However, Elu Mishal Tzibur, if he was willing to wear clothing up to 30 mana, that he's allowed to take from the communal funds. It was taken from the Shkolim as part of the community karbonos. But what if he wanted to have fancier begadim than that? If he wants even fancier begadim, that's fine, but he has to pay for that out of his own pocket. He can't make the tzibur pay for it. With that, Baruch Hashem, we're done. And Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach, tomorrow morning, we're going to learn Daf Lamed Hey. I'm also going to repeat it. We're going to learn the Mitzvah tomorrow night from 12:30 to 2:30, and we're going to learn Daf Lamed Hey again. And we're also going to learn Daf Lamed Vav, which will be Monday's Daf. Monday, before Mincha, in the Aguda, will be by around 7 o'clock. We're going to learn Monday's Daf again, for those who weren't there at night. And then Tuesday, an hour before Mincha, we'll learn Tuesday's Daf. And then Tuesday night, after Yom Tov, at 10:45, we'll learn both Mondays and Tuesdays Daf. They're not hard often, it'll go quickly. And then Wednesday morning, we'll go back to our regular schedule. So, shkoyach, everybody.
Shkoyach, Yosy, shkoyach.